There will always be resistance. The next battle will always be near. As long as you have everything, there will be those who have nothing to fear. And little by little, or maybe all at once, you will lose. Because our future is not yours to choose.
Welcome to Voices of Resistance. You are listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
The viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or the staff.
I'm Barbara Humphrey.
And I'm Albert Strickland.
Co-hosts of today's show. Voices of Resistance is a project of the Savannah Justice and Peace Collective. We give voice to resistors who have no voice in mainstream media and present a wide range of issues that affect us all.
But there will always be resistance. The next battle will always be near. As long as you have everything, there will be those who have nothing to fear. Because our future is not yours to choose.
So thank you for tuning in to today's version of Voices of Resistance. I'm Barbara.
I'm Albert.
I'm Phoenix.
And we have Savannah, of course, on the board,
Savannah
controlling
on the board.
everything.
Thank heavens for that.
And today we also have, I'm going to start with two special guests from a faraway mythical land, at least in our estimation, so I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
Hey, I'm Albert from Amsterdam, and next to me is...
Hey, I am Sjors, also from Amsterdam, Netherlands.
Thank you very much for joining us in the studio during Voices of Resistance. Today's show is entitled Silencing Change, and it comes on the 54th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And we are going to be talking about the three assassinations of the 60s that in particular saw change or potential change silenced. In addition to John Kennedy, we're going to be talking about Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King.
This is not the change that a lot of us would have liked to have seen possibly, but it was moving in the right direction. It was change that had to be silenced.
So. Right. It was change that there are obviously people
coming.
who felt needed to be silenced. Both JFK, RFK, and MLK were three intelligent, inspirational, and charismatic individuals who could have inspired the kind of change that was desperately needed in this country, at least taking us down the road to that change, and they were silenced way too soon, way before any of the changes that they had talked about, hinted about, could have come to pass. And certainly the circumstances surrounding their assassinations and the investigations that follow border on pure fantasy. I know many of you will say, my God, 50 years ago, can you let it go? Why bother?
What does it matter?
What does it matter? And we hope in this hour we will convince you that it absolutely does matter. We start by asking some very basic questions. Who benefited from the silencing? Who had the opportunity to silence? Who was accused of the act? And how legitimate was the investigation into the crimes and those who were convicted? And how did the investigations of the silencing of these three individuals, based on lies, produce more silence?
Well, there was a commission called the Warren Commission that was supposed to decide at least the assassination of John Kennedy, which all of us that are of a certain age can remember exactly where we were at that moment. So it's still important to a lot of us, because I'll say something like, you John Kennedy, and they'll say, "Yeah, I remember where I was at that exact moment in time," and give you all the details.
That's right.
And describe
Edward
it.
has
So it
certainly
was
heard me
important.
say that. Yes.
But also an interesting thing I've noticed talking to both of you is that the schools that you were in different locations in the country had very different responses, like the way
Absolutely.
that people reacted.
Yeah, and we will absolutely true, because certainly John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy were perceived in very different ways depending upon whether you were in the North or in the South, and perhaps to some extent Martin Luther King.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Here
Yeah.
especially, I can tell you what happened here. I was tell you where I was. I was sitting in art class in my senior year, and all at once over the loudspeaker came this statement that the president had been shot. The school uproar, laughter. Great. Teach him to come to the South.
Wow.
That's a fact. And that was the entire school, basically, because that time, remember, the school was just beginning to be integrated. My class was the first one at Savannah High. We had like 2,000 students, and only 8 was integrated. So it was still a very white school.
Sure.
But the moment that it came over a few hours later that he had died, the mood changed. Death meant something different.
That's very interesting. So I was sitting in my 11th grade American history classroom. It was a Friday afternoon, as was typical a lot at that time, maybe still so, is on Friday afternoon you typically had a test of what you had learned during the week or not learned. And we were just about to take the test, and the loudspeaker came on with the fact that John F. Kennedy had been shot. And in my classroom there was utter silence. And then I remember a few people started sobbing. And my history teacher, who I absolutely loved, just basically said to us, "You don't have to take the test. Do what you need to do." And a lot of people put their heads down, and particularly when the announcement was made that he had died. I mean, it was a weekend of mourning. I remember that none of the stores were open. Basically nothing was open. People sat glued to their televisions, watching this drama unfold, and in particular the drama that happened, I think it was the next day or Sunday, when the person who was accused of killing John F. Kennedy was shot in the jail. So we're going to talk about these 3 people, and there were many commonalities about them, and also about the assassinations and the purported assassins. The first thing which we can say is that all 3 of these individuals, in their own way, maybe not all at once, and certainly not necessarily loudly the way we wanted to hear it, did come out against the Vietnam War, which was a major issue at the time in the 60s. And they also took on issues such as organized crime, civil rights, poverty, and these were all things that were not necessarily supported by the growing military-industrial complex, that entity that Eisenhower had warned us about, the capitalists, white supremacists, and many more people.
Corporate fascists and others, yes.
Yes.
Not just corporate.
The assassinations all required the individuals who were accused to have gotten access to what should have been a very controlled space. All 3 assassinations were pegged as single assassins, the lone assassin myth, even though as part of the investigation, people saw, people heard, and there was evidence of many more bullets, many more gunshots than could have been fired by a lone assassin. And with JFK and MLK, the assassinations would have required expert marksmanship. And in the issue of JFK, not only expert marksmanship, but expert timing. All assassins were painted as having unstable mental health backgrounds and holding extremist political views. So they carried out these assassinations against high-profile political targets. And all 3 assassins were found to have kept diaries where they documented their hatred of the individuals who were assassinated, as well as other documentation. And it sounds like a closed case, If you catch them, you jail them, you accuse them, and it's a done deal. but it was all much too clean and pretty to be true.
Yeah, the odds of that happening, I'd like MIT perhaps to give us something about these odds, because they're virtually impossible to have done this, these three lone individuals.
That's right. And I think what stood out to us as much as the explanations we were fed was why the information that went into these investigations was put under lock and key. In fact, the JFK files were supposedly under lock and key for 75 years, but that has changed, and
because
I'm thankful
of the Freedom
for that.
of Information Act. Now, you can get freedom of information, but expect a lot of black spaces in it. You don't get the information.
A lot of
you only get what they want
redactions.
you to have.
That's true. Yes.
I was going to say, also with MLK, there was a lot of people aren't aware that there was a civil court case where the family of Martin Luther King sued the government for having a conspiracy to make his assassination, and the court case did find that there was a conspiracy that involved the mafia, the government, and the government in order to assassinate Martin Luther King.
That's
but they
true.
also only asked for like a dollar or so,
$100.
$100. Yeah,
Yes.
because the importance of it, they said obviously it wasn't a matter of reparations, but they
Right.
wanted people to understand that this was a conspiracy. That this was specifically something, like there was a reason why he was killed. And
Right.
so
Right.
who does stand to gain from these things?
Well, yeah, and we're going to give you a few reasons why we hope you'll agree with us that you should care about these. Because, first of all, when these events are allowed to go on and the true perpetrators remain unpunished and the evidence is concealed decades after the event, then what we're left with is puppet masters running our government from behind the scenes and committing assassinations, rigging elections, bribing politicians with undue corporate influence and gratuity, controlling the media, and creating a tyranny for us to live in.
No, not here.
Not here.
No, we're exceptional. We don't do things like that.
And it's just...
And if you can't trust the
course not.
government, who
Right.
can you trust?
That's right.
Think
And
about
it's-
that.
That's right. And it's disgraceful that more of the alternative media, I feel, is not covering these events, and more Americans don't appear to care, or when you try to talk about it, they kind of roll their eyes and look the other way.
It's interesting, something you said, because the mafia, for instance, Robert Kennedy, of course, was instrumental in actually the Senate,
Yeah.
where he worked in the panels to
Right.
bring the criminals, the mafia, to justice.
Well,
more or
he
less.
was Attorney
tried to.
General under
Right.
his brother.
And even before that, though, he worked on the commission, remember, to
Yeah.
bring these people to
Yes.
light and prosecute them.
Well,
and he
in
was very
fact,
successful at some of it.
Before he
which
was Attorney
didn't
General...
endear them as friends.
Well, but before he was Attorney General, ironically enough, he did... Joseph McCarthy was a friend of the Kennedys.
Yes.
And he did work for Joseph McCarthy's committee that was seeking out communists under every rug, around every corner.
In every cupboard in the kitchen,
in every
there's
cupboard
one
in the
lurking.
kitchen. And he finally left because he was so disgusted with what was happening, with how those hearings were being conducted. And I mean, the ultimate thing I feel is why we should care is that the same forces that killed these three individuals 50 years ago are the same forces that are still in control and responsible for the mess we're in today. There are still political assassinations that are happening. And until and unless we find a way to fix this mess, we're just going to keep having to live with it.
I agree that it is definitely a thing that it still exists as a problem, but it's also worth noting that these assassinations become a spectacle in and of themselves to distract people. We were also talking about this a little bit earlier, and I think a lot of people will get into this. And it's not to say that we're doing it now, but we're trying to avoid this thing of it turning into essentially just an unsolved homicide case, which is what a lot of people that are listening to this have probably experienced this as. Like they see things about the John F. Kennedy thing. It's like, oh, well, who was standing where and how many shooters were there and
Right.
things like this. But really, this is about the political implications that happen because of that. Like
Right.
in the end, this person died, but what do we do to maintain the work that they were trying to support? Do people really know what they were trying to support when they were killed and why?
No, because once they were silenced,
Right.
that was taken away, as
That's
we were
right.
discussing with King. Now the only thing you know about Dr. King is I Have a Dream.
Right.
But that whole year and a half before his death, That was not really part of his narrative at all. That's why he stood up against in Riverside Church, stood up with that no more silence. I mean, he wasn't going to be silent any longer about the Vietnam War when he was trying to put together the Poor People's Campaign to get people to understand that it's people that have the power. It's that we should be this. It's a people thing. It's a class warfare, as we mentioned before. And he was trying to bring all that together. That's dangerous to a government that's run by elites, and especially gain steam or power.
Right.
So they've got to put an end to it and change the narrative, which they did. Even the Martin Luther King Day parade here, it's all, I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream.
Right.
What about this time when he said, my dream has turned into a nightmare?
And really, there are still an awful lot of unknowns, an awful lot of speculation. I mean, particularly with John Kennedy, because an awful lot of what some of those closest to him were saying about his intent to get American troops out of Vietnam, to let the Vietnamese take control of their own country, a lot of that was done in secret because he was facing, in 1963, he was facing a re-election the next year.
63, yeah.
And, he was planning these things, but there were an awful lot of people who were conspiring to make sure that his plans were never going to be fulfilled. None of us knew, of course, that how they were going to keep him from fulfilling them. And to me, unless we change our systems, unless there's a major systems change, anybody who comes along who tries to really make change is going to receive the same fate.
You can't just reform this system. It's
Right.
not broken where you can
Right.
fix it and repair
Change
it.
it.
It needs to be totally annihilated, a new one in place where the people actually have the control and have the power. We're not going to get that through the reforms that these people are trying to do. We do have to take this in time, in context. The 50s,
That's
the
right.
60s, and the 70s really don't relate to what we know or what we do now in the same way. Society has changed that much. The South is no longer the South that actually laughed when the president was shot. The South is no longer that
Right.
type of community, at least.
Not as
it was
badly,
then.
at least.
Not as badly. Things have changed. I'm not saying that we're good, that we're perfect, that but we're different. It's just a
Right,
different
you're
time.
different. But I would say that as much as things changed, they also stayed the same.
The same.
Right.
Exactly. Because you've got
There's
the same system.
Right,
It
the
can't
same
change.
systems, the same players,
The same
in
racism,
control.
the same pillars of the supremacy which exist for the class.
Well, you remember
That's right.
when Martin Luther King received the Nobel Prize? What was the three things that he said in his speech?
the
were
three evils, the three evils of
He listed
Right.
three evils.
is militarism, capitalism,
capitalism.
and
Consumerism was one.
Racism.
It changed.
Well,
There was
racism.
there was
oh, he gave it multiple times. So
Yeah.
racism and then consumerism / capitalism,
Right,
and then
militarism.
militarism.
Yeah. So as we talk through these, I mean, while we don't want this to become a whodunit, I think it's important to point out that the official investigations that said whodunit were so incredibly flawed, it's hard to imagine anybody in their right mind believing that. So you really have to start with that in order to understand the lies we were fed, and then to ask why were we fed those lies, and how is that continuing to today?
In fact, the players that were back then, they have their same counterparts now.
Of course.
You know, the same basic players. We still have the families involved. We still have the Bushes. We still have all these people that were back then. They're still in power. We've got some coming up.
Yep, absolutely. And we've talked about sort of treating this in a little bit like a murder mystery, where you start out with who benefited, who had motive, who had opportunity, because not necessarily specific again to who pulled the trigger, but who ultimately benefited from the assassinations of these three individuals. And in the case of John F. Kennedy, we can talk. I mean, it happened in Texas. The person who became president
Was from
was
Texas.
a Texan. And there were certainly things that John Kennedy had done or proposed to do that would have had some negative impacts in
on
Texas.
those Texas oil
Those Texas
men.
oil
Yes.
men, yes.
And that's factual. He had already made rules, changed the rules.
Yes.
That lost
changed
them
the
money
rules.
and position with their oil.
That's right.
And that's not something you do to a Texan. Don't mess with the Texan's oil.
That's
if he's
true.
rich and powerful.
You know, in the case of RFK, the person who most benefited was Richard Nixon. You know, you could say, well, even if RFK had lived and ran against him, maybe Nixon would have won. Personally, I seriously doubt it, but it's always possible. But he was the person who benefited. With MLK, it's a little more difficult because he wasn't in an elected position. He was the head of a movement, or he was working with other people in a movement. So those who weren't kind of on the same page with him in his movement benefited. And, I have to say white supremacist society benefited because, he was really trying to move the country in a very different direction.
Yeah, not everybody was as blatant about how much they wanted to keep segregation as Bull Connor was. Some people were like that, but didn't just say it out loud.
That's right.
Well,
Well,
that's
you
true.
did have the Georgia senators, one that's in the news now again, and he's been dead for a long time, Talmadge. And also, in doing this research, we learned that the Warren Commission also had Richard Russell, which was the counterpart in the Senate to Talmadge
right.
at the time.
That's right.
They were called Dixiecrats. They were
Right.
Democrats, but they were
A-
very racist and
And even up north, where segregation wasn't by law but was de facto,
yeah.
there was not a great deal of love for Martin Luther King.
No.
It would have shaken up a lot in the North as well.
Well, actually, my understanding is that even like within the civil rights movement, he didn't have like a majority of support. There was a lot of fractionalization
Right.
within that.
In fact, the most
Yes.
the largest civil rights group didn't support him very well. Even in Savannah, when he comes to Savannah, they worked very hard to keep him out. They didn't want him in the city.
That's right.
Doesn't
He
surprise
was
me.
challenging the status quo.
That's right.
And
They
there were an
didn't like
awful
that.
lot of people on, of black and white who were part of the status quo.
People don't like the boat rocked.
Right,
just
that's
typically
right.
speaking.
Take your time, just relax. It'll come, absolutely. And in the case of JFK, I mean, the other group that certainly had motive were the Cuban exiles, because they were extremely angry at JFK for not supporting the Bay of Pigs invasion and overturning Castro. In terms of who has opportunity, it's an interesting question, because when you have three such high-profile people who theoretically are being protected by Secret Service, by police, who are in the limelight, and then suddenly, theoretically, at least three total unknowns manage to get close enough to assassinate them. You wonder about the motive of those who were supposed to be doing the protection, whose job it was to keep these people safe.
Of course, the only one who didn't have Secret Service protection was Dr. King.
Right.
The other two did.
But he had just moved to a different hotel that nobody was supposed
No,
to
Well,
know.
it wasn't
actually,
a different
no, we
hotel.
found
It was
No?
a different,
a different
room, in the
room
same
that
hotel.
had a
different
balcony.
room.
supposed to be
Oh,
on the
okay.
first
Well,
floor.
that's still
Yeah.
It was.
still though.
Who
You have to
moved
be in
in?
the right spot though, as the
Absolutely.
rifleman to know
That's
where they're
right.
going to
That's
be.
So there had to be more than one person involved to make those changes, because where
Or a
he was not possible to assassinate him.
That's
he
right.
had to come onto that balcony at that time,
That's right.
and there was
Or just a
individuals who-
mole
And he
inside the
was-
group, which is
and he
probably
was-
very likely.
Well, he was
In
supposed
fact,
to
it was,
have
yeah.
police protection. There was supposed to be protection around him, and somehow these protectors were called off.
That's right.
So
We don't need you guys today.
Yeah.
You just hang back.
Well, yeah, but like I said, we do actually know that this was a conspiracy, like proven by
it's
legislation though that it was.
No,
And-
it's not
and
proved by legislation. The court case, the civil case, was in Memphis. It was a jury that awarded the $100, and it was never accepted by the Department of Justice.
Wait, that's the thing that you can do. The Department of Justice can decide that a court case
Well-
No,
doesn't
they didn't
count.
overturn it.
No, they didn't overturn it.
They
I'm sure
just
they got their
ignored it.
$100. They just
Doesn't
ignored
matter.
it.
But no one knows about it.
But it's still part of the legislative process. How
It's
do
not
they get to
legislative,
just?
it's the judicial process.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So it's
Judicial,
because it's
not
a different
legislative.
branch, and I'm being really dumb
Well,
right
and
now.
also you're
Department
On the
of
radio.
Justice, you see.
And you're talking about a jury trial in Memphis, Tennessee.
Right.
And
But
you
it was
can-
a circuit court.
It was
wasn't
a
just
circuit court, but it
jury
was still a
trial.
jury trial. And, there's certainly ways to sway a jury. And, not having read the transcripts, although we understand they're available if somebody has a few years to read them.
It's just so confusing because I keep thinking that the government is supposed to be made up of the people, and so that when the law system is based on using a
Oh.
jury of peers, that it's supposed to actually set the
Well,
thing. You know?
I mean, we let me tell you, there are plenty of court cases that we could all read and say, how did they ever convict that person, or how did they ever acquit that person?
True.
The other reality is, very often when a court makes a decision, the person who doesn't agree with the decision takes it to a higher court. And court cases are overturned all the time. So it's...
But this one wasn't even
wasn't
overturned. It was just
overturned, you know.
ignored.
It was ignored.
Ignored.
In other words, the Department of Justice did not choose to reopen the Kennedy or the King investigation, or to even open an investigation, because they never investigated initially at anyway.
But this jury in Memphis did say that it was government and mafia. Definitely were conspired.
And this was after a long trial with a lengthy deliberation
Yes.
process with lots of evidence that was
Yes.
supplied.
Yes. If you want to go through the transcripts, please,
Go
I'd
through
love
the
to see them.
transcripts. I mean, I can't tell you how lengthy it was. I can't tell you what evidence was
They
presented.
said it was lengthy.
But we do know that the jury awarded $100, which was what was asked for, and the Department of Justice
Because they said that
chose
they
not
didn't
to
want
pick
it to
up.
be seen as a money thing. They
Right.
wanted it to be seen for what it was, just to try and get the truth out. That was the whole
That's
point
right.
of the case.
That's right.
Because it's important that we know the truth. If we don't know the truth, if we don't know how easy it is to conspire to assassinate people in this country, and we won't admit the fact that it is easy, people who want real concrete change perhaps, then when we get someone we really like, they're going to do the
Right.
same thing to them.
And
we
when
need
you
to know that
see
it's
the
possible to
three
stop it.
people who were accused of these three crimes, they were painted. Lee Harvey Oswald was painted as a communist who had traveled back and forth to Russia, which he had. And so basically the Russia connection was being blamed for that assassination. In the case of James Earl Ray and Sirhan Sirhan, the assassins of MLK and RFK, they were painted as mentally unstable, as having in their possession their writing saying how much they hated these two individuals. And anybody could have planted that.
It's interesting to know because it does take more than just that for these people to get close. But even if they get close, the changes that were made immediately, these aren't things
Yes.
that were planned where you can say, well, he's going to be here at this time. These are changes that were made, even RFK. It was not part of the program to take him out through the kitchen,
Through the pantry, right.
the pantry, but they did.
And John
It was changed at the
John
last minute, but he
Kennedy's...
just happens to be there.
Right, and John Kennedy's parade route was changed,
Yeah.
and it was sold as a change to give him greater access to the people. In fact, he was warned not to go to Dallas before he went, and he, as Albert said, he wasn't particularly popular in the South, and he went because he knew he was facing a re-election, and he wanted exposure to Southerners, and he was sold the change in parade route as a as to have access to more people.
But the fact that Oswald could be at that window at this particular bend,
Right.
it wasn't just a straight shot. And when the president was hit, instead of the Secret Service
Speeding up,
immediately
the
speeding
limousine
away, which
speeding
is
up.
what's supposed to be done, they
It
stopped, which gave access for more shots from other
Right.
people or from other directions, or
right.
even from him
That's right.
again.
And with MLK, as we said, he typically stayed in the Lorraine Motel, but he typically stayed on the first floor. And for some reason, the room was changed, and he was now on the second floor with a balcony room. And with RFK again going out through the pantry, and there's a little bit less known about whether suggested he go out that way, whether it was suggested that he shake hands and thank the wait staff for the work they had done. There are just so many unknowns. And we're going to stop here now. We're going to identify our station. First, we're going to thank you for listening. You're listening to Voices of Resistance. And you're listening to Voices of Resistance on WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. So instead of our typical sponsor announcements following that, we're going to have a very special announcement today to thank you to everyone who made a financial contribution during WRUU's first ever online membership campaign. Thanks also to our many volunteers who donated extra hours and other in-kind gifts to make this campaign successful. Together we raised more than $8,000, or about 6 months' worth of normal operating costs for Savannah's only community radio station. If you missed our campaign, you can still make a donation at WRUU.org. In this thankful season, we truly appreciate your support. And all of us can say this in their own words. You would not be hearing this show on mainstream corporate media. And Savannah is truly, truly lucky to have this kind of community radio station. And the station is truly, truly thankful for the more than $8,000 that was already donated. So if
Take
you have
out your
anything to add
checkbook,
to that-
Phoenix.
Okay, so I guess we are going to go
portion of
back to our...
Portion of
Oh,
WRUU-LP Savannah Soundings programming is made possible by a grant from Brighter Day Natural Foods, offering produce, vitamins, and supplements, and a deli and juice bar. Brighter Day is located at 1102 Bull Street at the south end of Forsyth Park. More information available at 912-236-4703 or brighterdayfoods.com.
Okay, you're ready. So now we're going to go back to our conversation about the silencing of change and talking about John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. So certainly John F. Kennedy did and said an awful lot of things to make an awful lot of people angry. And as president, he... in 1961, he initially supported what was called the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. It was Cuban exiles living in, mostly Miami, but living in Florida, who had fled when Fidel Castro took over. And
Those that
Kennedy-
had money and they left
Those
with
who
that
had
money
money,
mostly,
because
and they were
prior
fearing what would
to-
happen
that's
to them
right.
because of their crimes in Cuba. You're
That's
right.
right. Because prior to Castro taking over, Cuba was basically the playground of the rich and powerful. And
Mafia controlled.
politicians, capitalists, mafia, and when Castro came in and took over, all of those play people fled. So Kennedy had been convinced that these Cuban exiles were going to land in Cuba and be embraced by the people, and that the U.S. would follow, supporting the exiles, supporting the people. When in fact what happened is the exiles landed and they were not exactly embraced by the people because the people loved Castro.
Well, basically, it was their first taste of real freedom where they had
That's right.
say in
Real
things, and they were not
democracy.
going
That's
to
right.
bow down to the old overlords
That's
all at
right.
once and say, hey, welcome back, fellas. We're going back to our cages now.
Right, and if we go back to talking about class warfare, these were certainly not the people who were benefiting by Cuba being the playground of the rich and powerful, because these people were getting minimum wage, if anything, to be the serve staff, and they couldn't have loved Castro under Batista.
In the
I mean,
60s.
Cuba under Batista.
In the 60s, I read a book that Castro wrote, and I believe the title was History Will Absolve Me. And I want to get a copy of it. I haven't seen it since. No one ever talks about it. But he talked about the conditions of Cuba that he was fighting to
Right.
to say. And those are the very things, if I can read the quote from Kennedy right now.
Oh, I wish you would.
Because it relates to that. I mean, the
Yes,
people in Cuba at that point in
absolutely.
time were
Please.
victims of the highest degree, and he...
Right.
Yeah.
And as Albert reads this quote, I want you to think about 2 years. So in 1961, Kennedy was ready to send the Marines in following the exiles to take over Cuba from Castro. And here is a quote from October of 1963.
I believe that there is no country in the world, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime. I approved the proclamation which Fidel Castro made in the Sierra Maestra, when he justifiably called for justice and especially yearned to rid Cuba of corruption. I will even go further. To some extent, it is as though Batista was the incarnation of a number of sins on the part of the United States. Now we shall have to pay for those sins. In the matter of the Batista regime, I am in agreement with the first Cuban revolutionaries. That is perfectly clear. That was John F. Kennedy, an interview with John Daniel, 24 October 1963. That's less than a month before he was assassinated.
That's right. So just imagine how many people were angry at that statement. So, in addition, we talked about JFK threatening to cut oil depletion allowances, which were considered a right by Texas oilmen. He was considering reform or abolition of the Federal Reserve Bank. And as we know in more recent history, those leaders in the Middle East and Africa who threatened to get off the gold standard, we saw what happened to a few of them. Again, the same playbook. He signed an above-ground test ban treaty with Russia against the unanimous opposition of his Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he is known to have said he was going to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. So, there. And we did come across a number of sources who said he was planning the U.S. exit from Vietnam after his election. Would you like to read his quote to his neighbor in Hyannisport?
Let me see if I can find that now.
At the bottom of the
yeah,
page?
this
Yes.
war in Vietnam, it's never off my mind. It haunts me day and night. The first thing I'm going to do when I'm reelected is I'm going to get Americans out of Vietnam. Now, as a Vietnam vet, and in Vietnam 5 years after this, his plan, I don't like it, but for that day, it was definitely a revolutionary idea. But to divide a country and say that the bottom port has the right to decide what they want to do, excluding the whole country, the North and the South. We created the South. It was not there before us, and same with Korea. His plan, had it worked, or his and Bobby's, it would have created another South Vietnam, a South Korea, which is not what we want by any
Right.
stretch of the imagination.
Right.
We want countries whole and free, people free, not...
That's right. It was
enslaved.
purported that on October 11th in 1963, he had approved withdrawal recommendations of his Joint Chiefs of Staff, which was to initially withdraw 1,000 troops, and then the rest would be out of there by the end of 1963. Now, a number of his senior cabinet members and military people got together in Honolulu on November 20th and 21st and came up with another plan that would have intensified aggressive action by the U.S. in Vietnam. And it totally thwarted what Kennedy wanted to do. And it's surmised that if that plan had been presented to Kennedy, he would never have signed it. However, there was never an opportunity to present it to him because he was assassinated 2 days later.
But the man who assumed the position did.
Absolutely.
And
did and won and did even more.
That's right. Did far more. He
Far
bombed
more.
the North notoriously.
Yes.
Haiphong Harbor was mined drastically.
Yep.
South Vietnam was almost leveled in many
Right.
areas,
Right.
and Kennedy would never have agreed to that.
Yes.
At that point, it was still called, I think, police action.
That's right. So despite the number of shots that were fired and the distance from where they were purportedly fired, not only was John Kennedy not only did bullets hit him with accuracy to kill him, but also hit John
Governor
Connolly,
Connolly,
who I
yeah.
believe was he governor of
Governor.
Texas? Governor of Texas. So we talked a little bit about the Warren Commission. I was somewhat shocked because I had never really looked at the composition to see how many Southerners were on the Warren Commission, considering how much the South disliked John Kennedy. I was shocked to know that Earl Warren, who was a friend of the Kennedys, refused to allow certain testimony to be given to the commission, refused to allow certain people to testify, and that Gerald Ford, who later became president, was taking information from the Warren Commission testimony from the proceedings secretly to J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI.
Who didn't
So-
like the Kennedys either.
who also did not like the Kennedys. And we also had a Wall Street banker on the commission.
I was going to say, earlier you mentioned how important it is to get people to see how easy it is to assassinate these leaders. And it's interesting because perhaps even more important is how easy it was for them to actually destroy the movements that were going on by doing that, because it wasn't even just them. There's lots of other civil rights leaders that were assassinated in this time or turned into political prisoners, but with selective precise targeting of some of these people, when the 70s happened, all of a sudden it's a very different environment. Can you
That's
talk
right.
a little bit about the
Well,
difference that
First of all, think
how
about
things changed?
what it means to have somebody putting forth certain ideas assassinated. Let's say you supported those ideas.
Right.
How much courage would it take for you to step forward and carry those ideas forward, knowing that the person who just came before you got a bullet to the head and died? I mean, I heard that during the Obama administration when I was expressing disappointment with certain things that I thought he had said during his campaign he would do, and that he didn't do, that he seemed to turn about face. And I had a number of people say to me, well, do you think he could have really done that and been safe? Don't you think he was afraid to do those things? So one of the things that an assassination certainly does is scare the people around you. And, you know, it takes an awful lot of courage to stand up and say something knowing you could be the next one down.
Not just that, though. The end result was that the movement was totally shattered. The Prince of the Poor People's Campaign that was supposed to occur, that King was devoting every night and day to building, to take over the mall in Washington and hold it. It was an occupy. That's what they were going to do, occupy the mall.
And for those who haven't been to D.C., the mall in D.C. is the large area with all the monuments and stuff. It's not like a shopping mall.
No,
No,
it
they
was definitely
didn't
not a
have shopping
shopping
malls in those days.
It was
They
not
had
a
little
shopping mall.
centers. We call strip malls now, but that was...
And part of it was that these three individuals were so charismatic that the people around them followed them. So there really wasn't an opportunity at that point in those movements for another charismatic person to step up, because so much time and energy was given to these charismatic figures.
But that's
go ahead. Phil.
That's, I think, one of the critical things to maybe even learn about this also, though, is that when we analyze the history of these assassinations and see how much of an impact it had, something actually the Black Panthers specifically, and very related to this, started to notice and talk about publicly was the mistake of having a person. Actually, when you mentioned John F. Kennedy in this, it's actually kind of inverse of what we're talking about with the police and Barney Fife before, because this is like an institution where, like, yes, this is a good person and this, like, a relatively good person in this place of power, but like it has such a drastic effect on the entirety of like how people are feeling about the nature of their lives when this one person is killed. And like,
well, you're right, and clearly with the Black Panthers, a slightly different strategy had to happen. So you did kill a movement. The U.S. government was able to kill a movement, but because there were so many people, they had to use a slightly different strategy to do it. But they sure
and then the Black Panthers started to realize when it was too late that it shouldn't be about these particular figureheads.
That's right.
Like that was a huge weakness in their movement.
Right.
And that's something that we should definitely remember, that like taking on these ideals ourselves as opposed to letting these figureheads embody them and then let the ideas die with them.
Right.
That was one of the things that Occupy did, is that there was one in particular, I won't name it, but one in particular being harassed by the police, and this, we want to talk to the leader of this group.
Yeah.
So they pointed to a dog over there. Said, that's our leader right there, talk to him all you want.
Right.
We don't have leaders in this thing. And that way it does prevent this cutting off the head of the movement at that point. Now, it worked only because those people around him later did not continue what he was doing. Ralph Abernathy did try, but with the...
who was that? Can you clarify?
He was one of... he was the chosen leader.
He was, in fact, in the room with King at the Lorraine Motel the day he was shot. They shared a room together.
He and W.W. Law and a lot of other leaders, but they didn't continue the national combination of the poor whites and the indigenous peoples, and to make this Poor People's Campaign come to life. Had he been able to do that, that would have been probably the single most important event, more so than Kennedy or John or Robert Kennedy.
I would not argue that for a minute. Yeah.
This is something as a tourist from Amsterdam, I noticed that, like, sitting here in the studio gets really grim talking about assassinations, and the second you sort of open up your mouth and become like one of these figureheads, you get shot. So I have a question, like, maybe you can also dwell on this a bit, like what can you do if you're listening in? Like, do you then join a bigger representative movement, or do you do like maybe like localized things that do not get you into sort of the bigger political frame? Do you like organize on a smaller scale so that you don't get assassinated? Because this is the question that we're really dealing with. Like, how do you do politics without getting assassinated?
The thing is time and place.
Time
When
and
you're going
place,
back to the 50s
opportunity.
and the 60s in the U.S., today it would be entirely different, as Occupy was. You know, it was different than the 60s and the 70s
Well, there are still
movements.
people being taken out today. On
Yeah,
the
I know
local
they were
level,
there too.
At the state level and at the federal
Yeah.
level,
But yeah, the idea that the best place to work is base work. It's not up here trying to do all this. But in those days, you had an entirely different, having lived through it, an entirely different situation. It could not have happened then the way it's happening now, or hopefully the way it's happening now, where people are actually working from the bottom and trying to build grassroots elements. That didn't happen. When they tried, they too were taken out, such as Medgar Evers, some of the other leaders that were
and-
taken
and-
out for 40 or 50 years before that, because
Right.
the movement did not begin with Dr. King.
no.
It began in the early 1900s and the 1920s and 30s, and they tried. but-
It's
And
still-
in many people's minds, Occupy was taken out. I mean, it was
Of
the
course it was.
the bulldozers and the garbage trucks. But nevertheless, there were many
And the
people who
mayors
say
and the
it
governors,
disappeared. Yeah.
Well, it is still a good point though. Like the public discourse about things kind
Absolutely.
of comes to be like these sort of like these already formalized opinions that people can take on and have back and forth. But at the same time, like it then becomes completely removed from the participation of the people. So everybody is, like you said before, glued to their screens when the assassination happened, or like entire movements that were like, how do we as people like actually hold, like how do we hold ourselves as people accountable to where we're not, like this isn't something that hurts us so bad. What can we actually do
Well,
looking
there were
forward?
certainly efforts to do that. I mean, the anti-war movement was just starting. It was just growing. The civil rights movement continued to grow. But the people who were in the positions to make certain things happen changed. And those people were not purporting the changes, you know.
Well, y'all experienced it. I mean, could you describe a little bit like what that change was
civil
like?
rights movement, it was one of personality.
Yeah.
You know, just like in many churches, it's always the personality that decides or gets people together to do things. There has to be a charismatic leader, and charismatic leaders generally rule the day. It did in the civil rights movement. King was something who pulled people together on that way. When they invited him, and he pulled groups in, like concerned clergy and laymen against the war, which wasn't a civil rights group. But they're the ones that sponsored his speech in Riverside Church. But it was his personality that captured people, that would make them stop and listen.
Right.
And in those days, without that, I don't think it would have
Well,
happened. Even maybe today.
And there
I'm
were
not
some
sure. We
other
still have
people with
leaders.
charisma, but there was also a difference in tactics. I mean, Martin Luther King was clearly not working within the system. And the people in the civil rights movement who took over, Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young, the people who,
But
in
they
some
became
ways,
the system.
well, they were in this. They were part of the system. They became the system. In some ways, they were very charismatic, but they had a very different tactic of working within the system, which, as we see, is much less effective.
But see, this show is about resistance.
That's
and
right.
You can't work in the system
the
and
system.
resist at the same
That's
time.
right.
And even
That's
Dr.
right.
King did work within the system. He did apply for the permits. He did abide by everything that he
Well,
was asked to
yeah,
do,
but-
basically.
He wasn't always allowed
No.
those permits though. Sometimes he still marched without
That's
them.
right. That's
But
right.
anytime there was any sort of trouble brewing or he heard of it, he did leave. Because he
Anytime
did-
or
he
just
was anti-
sometimes?
No, anytime. He was
Anytime?
never around when trouble started because he wanted to use nonviolence.
Well, but
as
the
his
march on
goal.
Selma, like there was definitely trouble that happened, and like
He stopped.
He stopped the
and
first
retreated,
time.
Yeah.
and then he's
Only the second time, the only reason it continued is because of the federal troops that there,
That's
and
right,
that was
to protect
because of
them.
Robert Kennedy.
to protect him. He was very clever. He was
well,
very
I would
smart.
still call that trouble brewing though.
No,
Like,
there was no trouble because
Yeah.
they,
it felt
Bull Connor
just
and
felt
his
way
troops
safer,
stood by and
basically.
watched. Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, to some extent, these three people we're talking about were definitely part of the system.
Sure.
But they were also proposing changes that would have significantly changed the system, and in some ways maybe even would have brought it down and created a whole new
I don't
system.
think we can follow those same things
But we don't
today,
know.
though. I really
We
think
don't
we
know.
need to resist more, and we need to build from the bottom up, and we need to make those individual groups and
Yeah. And to some extent, we feel like courage is gone. We don't have the same, I mean, and I'm not faulting anybody. I don't know how courageous I would be if it came time to stand up and know that it could mean taking a bullet. So, are you looking where did the time go? We've
Yes,
got 10
where
minutes.
does time go?
Where does the time go?
Shame.
In our last 10 minutes, what do you think is our most is the most valuable thing that we should be talking about here?
Well, when it comes to, it depends on who you're talking about. When you're talking about Dr. King, which is still one of my favorite to talk about because of his opposition to the
Right.
Vietnam War, because of his speaking out, knowing that even his closest advisors telling him, don't do this, this
that.
is not civil rights. And
right.
yet he understood that it was exactly that. But it was civil rights for everyone,
Right.
not just for a group.
And we certainly don't have time to go into the details of his April 4th, 1967,
wish we
Breaking
did.
Silence Beyond Vietnam speech. But I urge you all to please find it, Google it. It's very easy to
It's on
find
YouTube.
and read it. You can listen to it. You can read it. It is a most amazing speech. Absolutely. And you can see where this was going to get him in trouble because he was tying capitalism, racism, and
He
militarism
was talking about
together.
the same things we're talking about now.
Yes.
The Vietnam War was taking all of our money, basically. We were borrowing just to pay. We even borrowed from Social Security to help fund this war because all war has to be funded. There is no country on the face of this earth that's been more involved in war than we have. So we have the biggest debt. We have the biggest bit of everything coming along. But all the funds that we do get have to be diverted. They can't be used for social reforms or for social needs or for poverty. It can't be used for that. They have to be used for bombs to make rich men
Right.
richer.
And
Every time, as I say, every
That's
time a
right.
bomb goes off somewhere, a rich man
That's
runs to
right.
the bank. Ka-ching.
and theoretically sending black boys over to fight for the liberty of Vietnamese
didn't
when they
have
don't
here.
have liberty at home.
That's right.
And
Well, he had a statement about that I did like. He said, "What I can now sit at a counter and order a hamburger,
Right.
but what difference does it make if I don't have the money to buy
that's
the
right. If I
hamburger?"
can't afford the hamburger,
So
and certainly if you're going to go over to Vietnam and get killed, what difference?
That's right.
You're fighting. He really put the three together, and it was a very powerful putting together.
But
So-
to destroy that took extreme measures.
Yes.
And now I ask, when we were at Occupy, we had these signs, the sign for the Memphis union strike, I am a man,
Right.
because they weren't treated as men.
Right.
And no one knew what it was. Any age going by. And you had to be our age almost to understand that. Or also the I have a dream. If you ask anyone, black or white, what is it? It's I have a dream. That's not who he was.
That's
In
right.
fact, that was something he said he really didn't intend to
Right.
put in, but
Right.
he did. And then it was requested at his speech. It wasn't the focus of his speech. So social reforms always take their toll on people. I've noticed one thing.
Yeah, you mentioned so that actually kind of through the assassination of Martin Luther King, the public gets to see a more reformist version of his politics, and that's something that I would really like to talk about. Because in Europe, or at least from the Netherlands, like my perspective on, for instance, the assassination of JFK was one with a sort of mythologized idea of this conspiracy. Like I was never really included in a political debate. It was always from the perspective of, whoa, yeah, who did it? And like it's like an exciting CSI episode or something. So for me, it never really reached, I never got to see it through a political lens. And I think that is one thing, like when we talked about how to guard yourself against these tools from the oppressor. Also, one of the tools is making it into a conspiracy theory. So, because you get the politics absolved out of it, and the
Sure.
public gets to see a more reformist version of these things.
It's a total distraction.
The point we said earlier when we were talking before we came to the station, remember, if you want to shut down a conversation, what's the first thing you say? That's just a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
There is no more discussion after
Right.
that. We're really not talking about the theory, the conspiracy theories. We're actually talking about, for me, what was real.
Right, the context.
Yeah,
around
and
it.
the way it happened and is happening now all around the world.
Right.
It was a conspiracy to take out Allende in Chile and to try and take out Hugo Chavez and all the other. Look how many wars we're in at this moment. And it can't happen by accident. It's not by chance.
That's right.
There is someone conspiring somewhere. And in the case of the U.S., it's our government.
And you said you were talking about Martin Luther King and the I Have a Dream thing, and like we've been in the Martin Luther King parade in the last couple of years, and we've also talked about in this show how militarism was something he was very much against and became a huge anti-war activist in the last part of his life. And now we see the JROTC and the Army like marching in the MLK parade, which
That's right.
I'm positive 100% that he would be very upset about that.
Yes.
Even the I Have a Dream, I think you would be upset
Even the
about.
I
How
Have a
about
Dream.
Oh yeah, a lot of the floats just say "I have a dream,"
that's
even
it.
though he said that his dream became a nightmare because it has not been the way that the systems have been trying to deal with integration have been horrible.
Yeah. So yeah, prisons are full of political prisoners right now. We have a lot of political prisoners. We did a show on that as well, and
Yes, we
you know,
did.
we still do it. If they can't take you out that way, they'll take you out any way they can. If you actually have a chance of succeeding, and they can't paint you just as a nut. Now, because of his charisma and his power, that couldn't be done.
Well,
So they were left with very few alternatives.
so you either hide in the public or you work with a large enough group of people to where there's no one person that it's all dependent on to be targeted as. That seems
if you
like
can't destroy the message, what do you destroy?
we can't destroy
The
an idea.
messenger.
But you can't really destroy the idea still, right?
They've
So,
done a
like,
pretty good job of it. I think
Well,
King would not be
yeah.
happy with it.
Yeah. Especially if the idea was never really able to get out fully to begin with. You know.
All these things are through changes. When you're
Right.
looking at the 60s with Kennedy, he changed from the time he went in to those 3 years later. He became more aware of things. What he believed when he went in had been altered by events that he would know nothing about. We know nothing about those events either unless someone points it out to us through our own research or through education in our schools, which you're not going to get. And there's only one thing I do have to say. I do notice there's one thing about Europe. Europe has been since the free speech movement started in California in the 60s, 10 to 15 years ahead of us in a lot of ways. Free speech was a major thing in Europe before it was ever even thought of here. A full decade at least, if not more. And the same with the anti-war movement and other things. You know, these things happen early where people have a better discourse. We don't get that discourse. We're more controlled by a lot of things than they are because we don't pay attention to things as much. It's not as important to us. There is an advantage. We are a multiracial, multi-ethnic country. Most of Europe is not, or
Was not.
Yeah, was not.
definitely less so.
Yeah, much less so. So it's same with Japan. When I went to Japan, you know,
Right.
naturally low crime was all Japanese. The Koreans were kept in one way, the Chinese in another, and
Yeah.
society functioned differently. You put all that mixed together, and things change. Unless you have people who actually can work this, so that we can work together rather than against each other. It's not that I'm Chinese and you're Japanese. It's that we're both human, we're people, and we need to work together and realize that we have the power. These guys that are doing all this don't really. We say, oh, he's the president, he can do this. No, he only does it because we let him do it.
Right.
You know.
So we have about 3 minutes left. Are there any last
No, we have
statements?
two.
Are there any last statements left that you would like to make before we make some announcements about upcoming things?
Oh, well, this is the Voices of Resistance, so definitely organize with folks and, keep those ideas. Don't
Resist.
let those ideas be dead,
Be
basically, is what
silenced.
I'm trying to
Yeah.
say, yeah. And
Okay.
that's all.
Okay, good. You want to make your announcement?
Oh, sure. So after tomorrow on Black Friday, which is typically thought of as a very consumerist holiday, there will be the Savannah's third annual Really, Really Free Market, and that's going to be at the Thomas Square Edwell Park Garden. Basically, the way this functions is as a free, open flea market with goods and services. We've had before people have volunteered to be like barbers have come and Tai Chi instructors have come, and people have brought books or lawnmowers and food
Clothing
and clothes. Bring
goods.
basically the idea is bring anything that you can or anything like tell stories or any kind of thing that you want to do, and everybody comes and interacts with each other. It's going to be between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. You can look up Savannah's Really, Really Free Market on Facebook, and the address is
114 East 39th Street. It's in between Abercorn and Drayton.
And there is very limited parking on that street. So please, when you come, just be patient, find spaces around the corner. Do what you can. But
And if
we
you-
hope to see you there.
Yeah. Also, if you bring a very
Well-
large quantity of things, please try to be around to get it at the end. We don't have that much storage.
No,
That's
we
right.
don't have any storage, really.
And yeah, in fact, it's the reason I like it so much. It's people sharing and
Yes.
giving what we're not using to other people who can use it, and instead of having them go out to these corporations, these malls, these big stores, and making them
Right.
richer at this time of year.
Yep.
We need to be reclaiming everything.
That's right. So next week on Voices of Resistance, in advance of World AIDS Day on December 1st, we will be talking from Stonewall to today, where what has changed and what has not. Many people think the AIDS epidemic is over, when in fact it's sadly alive and well. And so we will have a special guest with us, and we look forward to that conversation.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
We still have a minute.
Oh my God, no, it's 7 o'clock. So you're listening to WRUU? Is he on?
Yes, you're still on.
Well, you're listening to WRULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We're Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
It's so nice being an amateur, you know?
Yeah, it is.
You're listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.